Final Fantasy has traditionally been a series hosting a rich, interesting motley of characters, from chivalric heroes to megalomaniacal villains, each of them offering a unique colour to their own particular game, their own particular world. However, Final Fantasy has also occasionally played host to characters that fall short within a grander story, characters who have either been posited early as significant features or have been introduced immensely strongly, only to peter out in a frustrating irrelevance shortly thereafter. So how does this happen? What are the particulars and examples of certain characters and character arcs that don't quite nail it when it comes to storytelling, and where does that line get drawn between a solid supporting character who doesn't need an over-engineered plotline and those that actually should have moved the dial on story and diminish it without a more considered inclusion? Jumping right in, I think it's worth exploring the distinction between a supporting role and a major role, and where that line really is for different sorts of characters in a Fellowship quest. For example, one of the persistent casualties for some player criticisms over the years is often the non-human characters that feature in a Final Fantasy party. Whether that's Red 13 or Kimahri Ronso, there is always a few consistent players that suggest they are pointless, either from a gameplay perspective, a story perspective, or both. Now, I would argue that in most cases, these characters do serve a purpose, if sometimes quite subtly. Firstly, from an aesthetic perspective, the non-human comrade has often been packaged in fantasy and sci-fi adventures, whether that's Legolas in Lord of the Rings, Chewbacca in Star Wars, Spock in Star Trek, and even characters like Pikachu we could lump into this category. And what they do in the broadest sense is represent the fantasy dimension of the setting and story. They are representative of an alternative culture or species that is present in the world. Kimahri Ronso is a great example of this, and his periodic altercations with Baran and Yenki really establish, through showing rather than telling, what the Ronso culture is all about. So by the time we arrive at Gagazet towards the end of the game, we really have a feel for what this minority race in the world of Spira is doing. We see a similar use of Fran in Final Fantasy XII, Freya, and even Quina in Final Fantasy IX, and so on and so forth through Final Fantasy adventures when it comes to the non-human counterpart. As for Red 13, while he is used less as a representative of a whole other species in Final Fantasy VII, he does nonetheless convey this more esoteric Cosmo Canyon perspective on things. He is a party member that is an extension of Bugenhagen's planetary philosophies that transcend and in some ways contextualize this battle we are having against Shinra to save the planet. So personally, I do give a bit of leeway to the non-human characters for the most part. I get some takes, such as Fran or Freya dropping off in relevance, but they do nonetheless serve a purpose. They effectively progress a situation or scenario in their respective games, I think, without diminishing it or really negatively impacting it from their limited input. And it's more about player preferences and people that like these characters that are just a bit gutted they didn't feature a bit more. Turning to Final Fantasy's oft-perceived wasted characters then, I think some may also fall into this category of doing just enough to propel their part of the story forward. But it is a very fine line where, from certain perspectives, and for me even on certain playthroughs, if I'm looking at the game a certain way, it does feel like a bit more could have been done with them. So with these sorts of characters, I'm talking about like Dion Lazage from Final Fantasy XVI. I think he is a great example of this middling character. I think he proves a solid secondary to tertiary role in the game to sort of counter Clive. He has a very fraught and interesting arc with his misguided father and so on, and he's a formidable dragoon. So he became an instant fan favourite for these various facets of his character. Yet despite this, many still describe Dion as unresolved or unfulfilled as a character in FF16. Many felt that his fleeting inclusion was sort of dangled in front of the player, like tantalizingly, without being fully indulged, and this is evidenced in calls for additional DLC content focusing on Dion and bits like that after the game's release. So, like many people, I think Dion is a great character, he's a great aspect of FF16, but I would struggle really to call him a wasted character. He does have a beginning, a middle and an end for his story arc, And I think it's simply that his scarcity, impacting with his popularity and a desire to just see a bit more of him, really lends to this feedback from some players that his arc was a bit wasted. It's a similar sentiment, I think, with characters like Laguna in Final Fantasy VIII or Jecht from Final Fantasy X, who are popular characters, they are important foundational characters, yet they are confined to the past as precursors to the central story. So while personally I would love to see more of Laguna, I think he's a great character, it's because of my personal feelings thinking he's great, not because his arc is necessarily messed up or unfulfilled in Final Fantasy VIII. So Dion, Laguna and Jecht are examples of characters that I think sit on the edge here. They fundamentally do their job, but they are also immensely popular. Taking a step forward to more genuinely wasted opportunities with characters, I think Amarant Coral in Final Fantasy IX stands out as an enduring one. He is an example of style over substance in Final Fantasy IX, which is to say it's easy to suppose that Amarant's design came first, and this does often happen with the Square designers, and so he was crowbarred in without real consideration of how he would move the dial or move the trajectory on the overall story. Now, I always liked Amarant's design, but mainly owing to his arrival so late in the game events, his rather flimsy reason for sticking around, which is to see why Zidane helps people, it really doesn't add anything to Final Fantasy IX. And I've seen it suggested online in the past that you could remove him as a party member, you could just take him out of the game and nothing would change in Final Fantasy IX. So while he may be a useful battle companion, depending on your playstyle, maybe you find him interesting in terms of his design and aesthetic, he is introduced way too late, and more importantly than that, I think, he has a very poor raison d'etre and lacks any dedicated scenario focusing on him. So Echo, comparably, she's introduced quite late in the game as well, but the entirety of the Maiden Sari segment is dedicated to exploring her backstory. So that's an example of how quite an abbreviated way you can give relevance to a character. Maybe just a small dedicated scenario to Amarant would have elevated and just given him a bit more legitimacy for being in the game at all. Now, not quite as sparse as Amarant's role in Final Fantasy IX, but still noteworthy, I think, is characters like Cypher Almasy in Final Fantasy VIII. Rather than being introduced too late in the game, Cypher actually appears quite frequently in Final Fantasy VIII. He is Squall's foil, he is Squall's mirror image in many ways. But he was hindered from what was almost certainly quite an involved character arc due to the fact that half of Final Fantasy VIII was cut prior to the game being released. So evidence of Cypher's original importance can be glimpsed, and it stems not just from his recurring altercations with Squall, which begin right from the opening FMV of the game, but his hinted romantic past with Renoa, who is a prominent female lead in this game. He was very prominent in the marketing, the packaging and the advertising for Final Fantasy VIII. And of course, there's the consistency with which he appears in cutscenes and boss fights and bits like that. And yet, there is a certain unfulfilled aspect to Cypher, because most of these things are left unexplained or inconcluded. It might be considered that his ending FMV sequence is hinting at the character's redemption, but there is little in the game to show that he has any remorse or has seen the error of his ways, or even what happens to him, after we leave him after our final boss fight. So while on paper Cypher does have a beginning, a middle and an end for his story, there is a definite shadow of an arc there. You can almost see where aspects of his story have been left on the cutting room floor in a frustrating lack of resolve for this character. Moving on, and in keeping with rewrites, one of the most egregious examples of wasted characters is often considered to be Final Fantasy XV, and this is a game that is really quite a love it or hate it sort of experience for a lot of players. For my part, I find it an incredibly frustrating game because it has all of these tangent ingredients to be an all-time great, and when it shines, it really shines, but there is just so much about its execution, particularly story and particularly characters, that are so sparsely delved into that at times they are borderline incoherent. So, considering wasted opportunities with characters here, Lady Lunafreya is often cited as the most significant one. Indeed, it's long been known that Final Fantasy XV was born out of an abandoned Versus 13 project, with an earlier story focusing on a character called Stella. And for anyone interested in diving into this and how Stella became Luna, and so on. The YouTuber GameDove has done a great video on this recently, which I highly recommend. But a result of Versus 13 amalgamating into what would then become Final Fantasy 15 is how some of these recycled characters and character arcs played out and arguably diminished, with Lunafreya being probably the major one. So looking to Lunafreya's role in Final Fantasy 15 on paper, she is in so many ways the deuteragonist of the story. She is this elusive oracle whose largely unseen actions paved the way for Prince Noctis's adventure. Her fated marriage to Noctis is also a major aspect of the story, tying her to the geopolitics, the overtones of fate, and of course the central hero. And yet, not only is she sparsely seen, she has virtually no present-day interactions with Noctis until about 5 seconds before she dies, which is completely bizarre. It's one of those things where I feel like I've misremembered the game or forgotten bits, but I'm playing back through it at the moment. She dies, and then the scene cuts to Noctis and Gladio having an argument on a train. It's just insanely written in places, this game. Now, I do concede that Final Fantasy 15 has a rather unique way of trying to tell its story in how it delivers a lot of context and a lot of insight to characters after the fact and in the form of flashbacks. For example, we learn a lot more about Lady Lunafreya after the scene where she has died, and people like her maid and people that knew her in Tenebrae offer these flashback sequences as to what her intentions were, what her feelings were towards Noctis and bits like that. In a similar fashion, we learn a bit more about Ravus in retrospect and how actually he was, perhaps begrudgingly, but actively trying to help out Noctis in the long run. And that's a valid means of telling a story. I've seen it done in literature and elsewhere, where actually after the fact you look back at characters and think, oh, maybe they weren't so bad and bits like that. And it can work really effectively. And I think a great example of this retrospective change in perspective about a character is characters like Snape in Harry Potter, who right towards the end of those books, we get a reveal and it completely changes our perspective on what this character was all about. But I would say the difference here is that we've had 6.5 novels building our idea of Snape a certain way for us then to be able to change it so radically and in quite an emotive reveal right at the end of the books. I would argue with Final Fantasy 15, although we get these interesting retrospective glimpses of what Luna and even Ravus's kind of intentions were, because there wasn't that much substance given to them in the first place, it's really hard to move the dial and make these seem like impactful emotive reveals about them. And while much has been made of her originally being playable in a scrapped DLC, I think if they really wanted to do this fated Romeo and Juliet ending where they just meet in this final moment, they probably should have considered making Lunafreya's adventure and her segments playable through the main game, dividing it as they did with Final Fantasy VIII, for example, where events were just divided between Squall and Laguna, rather than what we got, which was a very two-dimensional glimpse of her, primarily from Noctis's perspective. And actually, I played the Terror Battle side quest in Final Fantasy XV the other day, which I hadn't actually done on a previous run, and it did make me laugh. As I'd suspected, there have been similar comments on this, because it's my immediate reaction, was how Noctis's relationship with this side quest character, Sarah, in this 20-minute side quest, has more emotion and depth and interaction than anything we see come between Noctis and Lunafreya in the main game. It just enforces how bizarrely Luna's character was written and included here. Now, in keeping with Final Fantasy XV, while I think Lunafreya is the most egregious example here, we have the party that surrounds Noctis, so Gladio, Ignis and Prompto. They are helped immensely by their DLC episodes. However, I would say that DLC shouldn't be used as a paywall for important story moments. But then we have characters like Aranea and Ravus, who are further examples of characters that I really wanted to like in Final Fantasy XV. I felt like they're characters that we are supposed to like and sympathise with, and yet we simply just don't see this come to fruition at all. So Final Fantasy XV is definitely an extreme example of storytelling and character arcs being wasted and being missed opportunities. And if we look back at Final Fantasy IV or Final Fantasy VI, we can see that these are games that had a huge cast of characters, but they had a very clear hierarchy of importance, and the characters were treated according to their role in the story. So characters like Locke and Terra, even Edgar and Sabin, having these sort of prime scenario segments, and then kind of filtering down to characters like Gore and so on. It shows how even with massive casts, you can actually manage to write a comprehensible story. So what we see here is various instances of meaningful characters and character arcs falling through the cracks somewhat for a number of reasons. Square have been known to recycle ideas from earlier games, with small things like Sorceress Edea being shifted from Final Fantasy VII to being slightly more prominent in Final Fantasy VIII, to major things like Versus 13 and Stella morphing into Final Fantasy 15 and Luna Freya. And these shifts and tectonic movements of character design and writing often results in essential aspects of certain characters being left on the cutting room floor, and thus a feeling for many of a wasted opportunity. I think Square did manage to rally and bring it back with a competently told story and set of characters in Final Fantasy XVI, and in a way the stripping back of peripheral characters and playable fellowships in Final Fantasy XVI in some ways was consciously done to prevent any erroneous or unfulfilled character arcs kind of falling through the gaps, as happened in 15. They are perhaps playing it safe as the company seeks to rebalance its approach to what a Final Fantasy story really is.